One more thing, mostly for my own curiosity. How would you describe the taste?
Hey gang, it's Revolt, and this is going to be a weird one. Ticks may only serve as minor annoyances in-game, but in the lore they're closely intertwined with the colonists of New Cascadia. By reading through various codex entries, we can gain additional insight into the anomaly, the cryo archive, and potentially even upcoming enemy types. Let's dig into what ticks can teach us about the world of Marathon. Ticks are arthropods native to Tau Ceti 4 and can easily be encountered in the perimeter and dire marsh regions. Prior to the collapse of New Cascadia, we know that they are the largest cataloged fauna in those regions. There's also some sort of dimorphism exhibited by the ticks, which is only referenced tangentially in the codex. We're quite familiar with the main variant of the tick, with its bright red body and explosive tendencies, but Dr. Tobias Lutero, who led tick research in New Cascadia, described a soft body nymph variant that would roll up like a millipede. A nymph, if you're unfamiliar, is a biological term for a juvenile form of an invertebrate. Let's put a pin in the soft body nymphs and circle back to them later. While Dr. Lutero noted that their behaviors were generally aggressive, there were two non-aggressive behaviors noted. The first was foraging, which we'll talk about shortly. The second was a strange behavior called waving, and was described as follows. Tick ceases movement, lifts each leg in succession, and rotates it counterclockwise. There's no further information about this behavior, but it certainly inspires curiosity as to whether this is a reference to an idle animation, a social behavior, or something more profound. It appears the human presence on Tau Ceti 4 immediately created turmoil in the tick population. While they were always somewhat hostile to humans, it appeared that they became increasingly so with exposure. A conversation recorded between an engineer and xenobiologist prior to the founding of New Cascadia noted that ticks were viewed as pests rather than outright hostile. Specifically, ticks kept eating at the buildings, but the xenobiologist notes that they're exhibiting foraging behavior, not aggressive behavior. Take a listen to this conversation so you can hear the mild frustration that they have about the ticks.
You're not usually up this early.
Double shift to rewire a prefab panel. Ticks keep snipping through the insulation.
Well, at least they're not aggressive.
Trying to eat our HAB unit seems pretty damn aggressive to me.
Tobias says it's just... what was the phrase? Non-territorial experimental foraging. They're taking nibbles of our stuff to see if it tastes good.
So while the ticks were initially relatively benign, it was noted that human waste, be it trash or sewage, immediately impacted local fauna. The exact impacts are somewhat vague, although the colonists stated that the consumption of human waste could result in the sudden emergence of coprophagy in native arthropods. Coprophagy, by the way, is a polite word for the consumption of feces. While we know that ticks are not the only arthropods on Tau Ceti 4, they're certainly the most visible, and it feels reasonable to believe that they're included in this behavior. With exposure to humans came evolution, and we hear several references to ticks becoming more hostile, exhibiting increased aggression and increased swarming. They even rapidly evolved to develop contact toxins. Here's a recording from entomologist Dr. Lutero shortly after being attacked by a tick.
I think it's time to call off the domestication study. Captivity doesn't suit ticks. The little guys went from indifferent to aggressive in a matter of weeks. I expected some level of adaptation from the local fauna, especially after we started studying them in detail. But evolving toxins so quickly, I think it's a direct response to our continued ecological presence. Honestly, impressive.
Ticks continued to develop these behaviors and defense mechanisms until they became what we know them as today. They explode in a superheated biomess upon detecting a runner. Cyberacme's notes on ticks state that the aggressive nature of the ticks is likely due to territorialism, and states that another theory is that the ticks recognize the heat and biomatter on the runner as a food source. The third theory they provide, however, is the most intriguing, and consistent with Tau Ceti's anomalous threat response. Cyberacme's tick nest entry states the following. Another theory is that their aggression, should they recognize the human form, has less to do with identifying a food source and more to do with cellular memory, triggering survival instincts in response to encounters with something they view as a natural predator, due to severe harm inflicted on their species during colony-era research endeavors. This increased aggression, venom, and explosive response drives home the very first point that I want to make. The anomaly has significantly impacted local wildlife, spurring rapid evolution among native species in apparent response to human activity. Alright, let's talk about tick milk. If People have pointed out the tick milking pods in Dire Marsh's greenhouse region. There are definitely ticks being bred, raised, and having their waste harvested in the pods visible there, but these ticks are not being milked in any sense of the word. Let's listen to Dr. Laterra's description of the process.
Tick milk isn't really milk. Ticks have high protein content in their waste secretions. We encourage the ticks to deposit their waste in collection pods with artificial pheromones. When digested by genetically modified bacteria, the resulting liquid is a complete protein for humans.
Is the harvesting procedure hazardous?
Oh, no, not for the ticks. A bit tricky on our end, though. Pheromones make the ticks more territorial. I designed specialized PPE to protect our cultivation staff, just waiting on admin approval before we roll it out.
Point 2. You don't milk ticks. Tick milk is fermented tick poop. Tick poop kefir is probably the most accurate touch point. Dr. Laterra has a description of the taste and consistency for us as well.
One more thing, mostly for my own curiosity. How would you describe the taste?
Textures, halfway between engineered milk and yogurt. Flavors, yeasty.
Sounds pretty good. While Dr. Laterra states the harvesting process is not hazardous for ticks, take a look at the greenhouse facility in Dire Marsh. I could certainly understand why this would create a perception of humans as natural predator for something like a tick. There's one more thing I'd like to point out to you here, and that involves circling back to the tick nymphs comment I made earlier. The greenhouse facility contains tick symbols, tick eggs, plenty of other evidence of tick cultivation. So what are these creatures that we're seeing here? I'm reasonably confident these are juvenile ticks. We see them being cultivated in these sacs, where they later mature into bright red ticks that we more commonly see. This would just be a fun fact except for one little detail. These nymphs also exist on the UESE Marathon, in the room behind the compiler fight. This has two implications. The first is that somehow ticks are in space. How exactly they got there is certainly a cause for curiosity. Did humans bring them from the planet into the marathon? Spit? Something else? The second implication is the final point that I want to make today, which is that I find it unlikely that these are a reference to wasp enemies. As far as I can tell, the nest, blood, and body viewed behind the compiler room are all readily explained by our existing knowledge of tick biology. So what are our takeaways today? The first, tick milk is not milk at all. It's fermented tick poop kefir if you're feeling fancy. Second, it's abundantly clear that the human arrival on Tau Ceti 4 wrecked the local ecosystem, driving ticks into a state of hyper-aggressive evolution driven by the anomaly. Finally, seeing these soft-body nymphs tucked away on the UESE Marathon makes a pretty strong case that the mystery lifeforms behind the compiler fight are just ticks in a different stage of life and not wasps. And there you have it. More about ticks than you thought you were going to know, more about ticks than I thought I was going to have to learn. Pretty cool stuff. Pretty glad that I spent the time digging into it. If you think I'm missing anything or have a different read on the evidence than I do, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you in the next one.